What's going on, CDL fans? Today we're going to talk about OpTic, Texas, and Atlanta FaZe, do a little season preview, and what I think they need to do to have a successful year. I made one of these videos for LA Thieves recently, and I was requested here by my guy Cohen to make one for OpTic and FaZe. Obviously, unlike Thieves, OpTic and FaZe didn't make any roster changes, so I figured I'd just combine them into one video. But let's get started by looking at the individual stats for each player on OpTic Texas. Once again, I want to state, obviously, these stats and these cards are not really the determining factor of who's good and who's bad, but it's really the micro stats at the bottom down here that give us a sense of sort of the impact they're having on the map and the different things they're doing in each game mode. So as always, take stats with a grain of salt, but I do think they're a pretty good indicator at some of the stuff players have done. Looking at Shotzzy, I mean, he was great last year, right? He was a two-time MVP. He was their best player all year long. I think Shotzzy had a super good year. Potentially could have won MVP last season, in my opinion. The damage exactly might not be there, but with the guys like Kenny and Dashy behind you, honestly, you're just getting all the cleanup kills. So Shotzzy did his role perfectly. And beyond the stats, of course, is a guy that makes game-winning plays that don't show up on the scoreboard. Now let's take a look at his sub-duo, Pred. Now, Pred definitely had an interesting year. He had a really bad stage 4, which I definitely think tanked a bunch of his stats. But overall, I mean, Pred did his job. People might look at this card and think 84 overall, it's really not that good. But at the end of the day, when Shotzzy was playing at MVP levels, Pred really took a back seat and did what he needed to do and showed up in big moments, which we're going to talk about in a minute. It was actually surprisingly not that great at SND this year, when in previous years, he was one of the best SND players in the game. But obviously, at the end of the day, OpTic ended up winning a lot of the time when it mattered most, so it doesn't really matter all that much what Pred's individual stats look like. Keep it moving, let's talk about Dashy, a guy who obviously is going to be sitting in the hill. He's going to be playing that objective time, hence why things like kills per 10 minutes or even first bloods don't look that great on his stats. But because he's sitting in the back lines, you shouldn't really expect him to be getting a lot of kills per maps or even getting first blood in SND, because when you have Shotzzy and Pred and even Kenny who picks up the pace in front of you, he's really going to be just sitting in the back and doing his job. So I really think Dashy was probably the best main AR, especially by the end of the season. And then last but not least, looking at Kenny's stats, I mean, similar to Pred, he definitely wasn't as good in SND, but overall, I mean, Kenny really picks up the pace. He lays down damage. He gets kills at a pretty high rate, I feel like, for a lot of ARs. He's also surprisingly good in first bloods in SND, which I actually didn't realize until now. And then, of course, bringing in Kenny to this team, we all know the intangibles this guy brings: the leadership, the communication, the ability to keep your team's head on straight and keep them locked in down the stretch in the season. So obviously, Kenny, an amazing pickup, and of course did it in the stats column as well. But what I really want to talk about now is the X factor for this OpTic Texas team, because of course, they didn't make any changes. I mean, they're going into a new game in BO6, so obviously that can affect the team dynamic and how players perform. But what does OpTic need to do if they want to go back-to-back at champs? And for me, obviously there's a bunch of things every team needs to do. Of course, it's not all going to rely on one thing. But for me, the X factor is actually pretty clear. I think if you really look at when OpTic Texas was at their best last season, during Major 3 and during CDL champs, and then even when they're at their worst in Major 4, I feel like there's one player specifically that stands out as really performing or underperforming, and that guy is Pred. Once again, stats and cards are not everything, but let's just take a look. At Major 3, Pred was outstanding. I mean, he was just doing it all on the map. Credit to everyone else on OpTic, especially Shotzzy and Dashy. They were also really good at Major 3. And then at Champs, Pred, I personally think, should have won the MVP at Champs. I mean, he was phenomenal. I definitely think Shotzzy had the storylines and stuff behind them, which is part of the reason he won. Obviously, also played really well. And then when you look at the only stage Pred really struggled, it was, of course, Major 4 when OpTic got top 12. When Pred was struggling, OpTic was struggling. When Pred was slamming, OpTic was slamming. But now let's take a quick look at OpTic Texas' schedule for the season and discuss what stages or what majors they could potentially take advantage of an easier qualifying schedule. As you can see here in stage 1, Major 1, they do play Ultra, they do play Thieves, they play Cloud9. Overall, though, they don't play FaZe, so this is definitely one stage they could potentially have a really good one. Moving on to Major 2, they do play both FaZe and LA Thieves in this one, but their LA Thieves matches are front-loaded this year, so in Major 3 and Major 4, they're not going to have to play Thieves, at least online. Obviously, on LAN, they'll probably end up facing off. We look at Major 3, they play FaZe. And then Major 4 qualifiers, I mean, this really is the big one, right? They don't play either of the other top 3 teams. They play Surge, they play Boston, Ravens, Gorillas, and Ultra. So overall, Major 4 for OpTic is really going to be, I think, the big one where they should be going 5-0 into the Major as potentially a first seed. So yeah, I think for OpTic Texas, if they want to go back-to-back, they definitely are going to need to get the best out of Pred and Shotzzy. I think the sub-duo as a whole is kind of what you're going to want the best out of. But I really think Pred is that X-Factor guy. So if you're an OpTic fan, let me know down below your expectations for the team this season. But now let's talk about Atlanta FaZe. Obviously a team that's looking to rebound after their disappointing performance at at top 6 at champs last year. Obviously still won 2 events, but let's look at their individual players. Starting it off with the reigning MVP, Simp had an amazing season last year. Obviously, you could tell that by the stats. Even if you didn't know his stats, if you just watched FaZe play last year, it was obvious Simp was absolutely slamming almost all year long. I mean, he was one of the best slayers in the SMG category if you just look at these stats. I mean, he's got 97s all around down here at the bottom and 99 in control damage. He really was doing amazing things. And even when it comes to the objective play, he was one of the best. I know these are gray, but 83, 82, 93, he was one of the best objective SMG players in the game. Keeping it moving, let's talk about his Tiny Terror sub-duel in aBeZy. Now, I personally think aBeZy was potentially one of the most underrated players last year. I've done multiple videos this offseason going into like stats and breaking down some of the things that happened this past season, and it really is clear that aBeZy had a super underrated year. I mean, you look at his stats, you look at his card, I mean, he was just great all around. The only area maybe you could say he was bad in was really like hill time and ticks per round, but at the end of the day, when you got Simp sitting in the hill, as well as you got Cellium sitting in the hill, aBeZy really is just that entry guy who's going to take some routes. He's going to get in the enemy's face. He's going to make things mixy. That is his job. Obviously, when you look at the stats, it's good, but you really take in consideration those intangibles. It really is easy. I mean, we talk about too easy for aBeZy. In reality, it's too easy for aBeZy's teammates because of the things he does on the map. Next up, let's talk about the newest face on FaZe last season. It is, of course, Drazah. Drazah truly was like the key player, or I feel like the perfect player on paper and even in game for what this FaZe team needed. They needed an AR player that was going to keep up pace with the Tiny Terrors, and I think Drazah did that great. Obviously, as I said, top 6 at champs was super disappointing, but unfortunately, like every team is going to have a bad event. It just happened that FaZe's bad event was at champs. But I mean, Drazah was just solid all around. I think he really did his job. Surprisingly, he was, you know, bad or worse at SND, which is, like I said, surprising because he was one of the better SND players. It's pretty much the whole time he's been in the league. I mean, Drazah is an SND grinder. He really was, at least on Thieves, historically a good SND player. And last but not least, we got none other than King Cobra Cellium himself. I mean, obviously, the KDs are #1 in the league. I mean, Cellium pretty much always has the #1 KD in the league. That's not a surprise anymore. The hill time and the objective play was also pretty solid out of Cellium that I feel like maybe some people forget about. A lot of people like to compare him to Dashy and say, oh, Cellium doesn't sit in the hill as much as Dashy. Obviously, it's not as much, but Cellium still sits in the hill a lot. I mean, he does it the most on his team, and obviously someone has to do it. Cellium just is the consistent backbone for this team that they can always rely on to basically get a big kill when it matters most. Overall, he is a pretty clutch player. Obviously, last year, the big, 1v3 at a Dashy where he killed Cellium and then ended up getting the bomb plant down and then killed Drazah. That whole thing, Cellium definitely made some plays last year that seemed a bit unusual from what we've grown to know from him in his career. But touching specifically on Cellium and the X factor for FaZe, I do think it's him. I think it's Cellium. When FaZe are at their best at the Esports World Cup at Major 2, Cellium was playing amazing, and most importantly, he was picking up the pace and really making his presence felt on the map. Cellium is obviously one of the slower players in the league, and people fault him for that, but at the end of the day, that is his role on the team. But when you look at when FaZe were winning, obviously, I mean, Cellium's cards are always going to look great, right? I mean, the guy just is slamming in KD every single, every single major, every single series. So don't really look at the overall ratings, but just to give you a feel, I mean, when Cellium's at his best in Major 2 at the Esports World Cup, this was really when I felt like he was getting more active on the map. He was making the big plays for his team. And when he speeds up just a little bit, you notice just the difference in how FaZe is playing and how much success they're seeing. I think OCTANE actually said it best earlier this year. He said if he was Atlanta FaZe, he would sit Cellium down and make him rewatch his VOD from Major 2 over and over and over so he can replicate it going forward, because Major 2 Cellium was insane, bro. Like, he was so good. So I really think Cell is the X Factor player here on this team. I think you know what you're going to get out of Simp and aBeZy. I even think for Drazah, like, he might have some series here and there where he's going to struggle or something, but overall, Drazah is also doing his job. I really think when Cellium is performing at the top of his game, that is when FaZe are at the top of their game. And now let's take a minute to look at Atlanta FaZe's qualifiers and see what stage they have that they can take advantage of to get that #1 seed. Looking obviously early on here, they play LA Thieves, they play Ultra, they play Cloud9, they play Ravens, they play a lot of the top upper end teams in Major 1. Then Major 2, they do play OpTic Texas, and they do play Cloud9 again, but honestly, Major 2 is not looking too bad for FaZe. I mean, especially considering FaZe obviously had a great record versus OpTic last year, so if they continue that, this could be another flawless stage. Major 3, FaZe also play OpTic and Ultra and Ravens, and then Major 4, they play LAT, they play C9 again. So honestly, FaZe doesn't actually have one stage this year where they should almost be like guaranteed, you know, a flawless finish, not playing one of the top teams. So it's going to be interesting to see what stage FaZe takes advantage of, but obviously, historically, FaZe is pretty good online. I'm not calling them onliners by any mean, but they're pretty good online. They typically, you know, they're not shy to drop a 7-0 or a 5-0 stage. But yeah, I think we're in for an amazing season this year with OpTic, FaZe, and Thieves as the top three, all with superstar players. I mean, pretty much all of like the top 10 players in the game are on those teams, of course. I think this season's going to be absolutely insane. If you're a FaZe fan or an OpTic fan, let me know in the comments your expectations for the team this season. How many events do you want them to win? Things like that. And if you got any more ideas or requests for videos, content you want to see me make here on the channel, definitely feel free to let me know. Drop it in the comments or DM me down on Twitter. But with all that being said, sub to the channel for more content, and hopefully I'll see y'all in the next one.